This is People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. In each episode, writer and educator Sandy Carlson talks with a person who has been influenced by poetry and become a poet or a supporter of this literary form. Stay tuned.
That's why I'm a writer, because of that experience of being in the trance. And when and what that means is I'm butted up against the mystery of creativity. And to me, that's a spiritual experience because it's unknown. It's the unknown. We'll never understand it. We'll never know it completely, but we seek it. And that's why creativity and spirituality are so tightly woven in my life.
Hello and welcome to People and Their Poems podcast, a podcast about the poems that matter. I'm Sandy Carlson and I'm here today with Nancy McMillan. Nancy lives in Bethlehem and she is the award-winning author of March Farm, Season by Season on a Connecticut Family Farm. Her essay For the Love of Linen, Connecticut Literary Anthology 2020 was a Pushcart Prize nominee. Litchfield Magazine publishes her feature stories, one of which won first place in the Connecticut Press Club 2022 contest. Her work has appeared in Pangyrus, The Sunlight Press, Persimmon Tree, Fiction Southeast, and Edible Nutmeg, and her reviews have run in Connecticut newspapers. She directs the writing program at Arts Escape, where she helps students embrace and inhabit their innate creativity. Find more at www.nancymcmillan.com. And the McMillan is McMillan. Welcome, Nancy. Thank you for taking your time out of your day to be with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Sandy. I really appreciate it.
You know, I'm very intrigued by the language in your bio where you talk about helping people embrace and inhabit their innate creativity. What does that mean to you to inhabit your creativity?
Well, I think it means to open up enough to it that you are living in a different way, that you're more aware of what's going on around you in your life and within you, and to respond to life with that way. And I think that the thing about writing or being an artist, but specifically about writing, is that we write to remember, to live our, as Anais Nin said, to live our life again, to have those moments, and record them and be able to draw more meaning out of our life.
So Anais Nin talks about writing to remember and to relive our lives, as you said. Is poetry of personal experience for you, or do you see it more as a public art form?
Oh, both. For sure. I think poetry is very private, very personal experience that way, but it's also like all art, when you share it, it opens up, more possibilities. I also love that I'm also a musician, I'm a pianist, and I'm a piano teacher. So I think about this a lot when I go to classical concerts and other concerts too, but that's my most common concert to show up at, is a classical concert. There's a sense of we're all together and we're focused on this one expression of art, whether it's poetry or music or drama. And it has a feeling of church, of being in church, because even though we're all together, we're not interacting with each other, verbally, but we're focused on this bigger thing that has been created to be brought to us and to show us something. And so that's how I experience the public part of it.
That resonates with me. When I was growing up, my mom had a record album, vinyl, one of the thick, right? And it was Beethoven's Fifth. And there was nothing like coming home from school and putting that thing on loud before mom got home, Years upon years later, after my mom passed, my daughter bought family tickets to go hear the Hartford Symphony play that. And it was such a deeply moving experience to watch the performers come together and play their instruments to create this this understood piece. You know, we all know what Beethoven's Fifth is, and yet when all that soul goes into it in one space, it is, and it's the silence within that is really, really profound and deeply personal in a very public way.
Yes.
Would you tell our listeners how you describe yourself as a writer? You've got such a diverse resume of types of writing that you do, from journalism to poetry.
Yes, I dabble, I guess. My first love is fiction. I've written a novel, and right now I'm trying to get it published. But I love the trance that fiction puts you in. I think that's why I'm a writer, because of that experience of being in the trance. And when and what that means is I'm butted up against the mystery of creativity. And to me, that's a spiritual experience, because it's unknown. It's the unknown. We'll never understand it. We'll never know it completely, but we seek it. And that's why creativity and spirituality are so tightly woven in my life. So I would consider myself a real organic writer. I follow my nose. I didn't plan to write the book. I didn't plan to write a novel. I had an idea, and all of a sudden I'm writing chapters. I didn't plan to write the book on March Farm. I was kind of led to do it. It called to me. I kept saying, somebody needs to write this book. Somebody needs to write this book. Well, you know what happens when you start saying that? You've chosen yourself. And I love the short forms. I love the long forms. I love to see what's happening now with writing, how people are expanding and, taking apart the forms and putting them back together in different ways. It kind of reminds me what happened to music in the beginning of the 20th century. When the 20th century came in, all the composers, they just started to tear apart all the forms and put it together in all different ways. So that's the 20th century has a greater variety of kinds of music than any other period. So that's kind of what, in a way, it reflects what we're doing with writing now.
It's interesting to see the trends in poetic writing, whether the interest in form versus the deeply personal free verse. Here's what I'm thinking on a page kind of thing. And I've seen a demand for form becoming more prevalent, which is interesting. I mean, it really sets up a different kind of challenge when you have an idea, what rules you're going to impose on yourself to get that idea across, and why you choose that form. So sounds like a very deeply self-conscious time of the 20th century for music, and in the same way with poetry now.
Yes, I think so. One piece of writing advice I remember reading is always write into a form. And I can understand that, decide what this is going to be and write into that form, even if you change it, because I think it's quite challenging to write without any rules. I think Robert Frost said he could never written if he didn't have that form to follow. So it's an interesting process to watch what's going on.
It is, and it honors the audience too, whoever that will ultimately be, and I think it affords some access for them. When you see a sonnet, you're heading for something deeply personal and emotional. I think Edna St. Vincent Millay made great use of that to say some pretty direct things to her loves. Growing up, my great uncle would talk about how my aunt would read Edna St. Vincent Millay to him when they would take long drives down to or over to Meriden from Darien. And I never knew what the significance of that was until I read some Millay, and it was very, very explicit poetry, but it's embedded in this beautiful form. Mm-hmm. And it invites us to be surprised, and it invites us in to be a part of the experience. So I think that's great advice.
Yeah.
So speaking of influences, what is a poem that's been a poetic influence for you as a writer? Can you share a poem with us that you think is important?
I would love to. This is a poem written by Sarah Teasdale, who wrote in the early 20th century. She was a lyrical poet. She won the first Pulitzer Prize for poetry, and she's kind of fallen out of favor. But her poetry deals with nature. It deals with the mystery. It deals with death, and those are my favorite topics. So this is called Twilight, and right underneath the title, parenthetically, it says Nahant, which makes me think that she may have written it in Nahant, Massachusetts, which is a little island off the North Shore. She has another poem called Nahant, but this is Twilight. There was an evening when the sky was clear, ineffably translucent in its blue. The tide was falling and the sea withdrew in hushed and happy music from the sheared, shadowy granite of the cliffs, and the fear of what life may be and what death can do fell from us like steel armor, and we knew the wisdom of the law that holds us here. It was as though we saw the secret will. It was as though we floated and were free. In the southwest a planet shone serenely, and the high moon, most reticent and queenly, seeing the earth had darkened and grown still, misted with light the meadows of the sea.
Oh, that's beautiful. The meadows of the sea conjures some really rich imagery. What resonates with you in that poem?
Well, first of all, the use of language, that's what I love about poetry. I'm always telling my writing students, read poems, because poets use fresh, original, surprising, delightful language. And that's, I don't have to explain that to you, but that is their specialty. And Meadows of the Sea, it's perfect. And it's so surprising too. I read this at my mother-in-law's memorial service, and I think that's what, to me, that's what, this is all about, like facing death, which I think is in society we need to do more. We know all about birth, but we don't really, face death in the same way. And I just love these images. Fell from us like steel armor, as if we were entrapped, physically entrapped. There's a visceral sense to that. And then the secret will, which is, to me, the mystery. And then this beautiful part about the planet shone serenely, most reticent and queenly. And any poem that mentions the moon has got me hooked. So, and the rhyming scheme is there, but it's not so strict. So there's a kind of a flexibility to the form, and there's just a beautiful rhythm and meter to the voice here. And as a music teacher, I'm constantly hounding my students about rhythm. And I used to believe that the three elements of music, melody, harmony, and rhythm, were equal, but I no longer believe that. I believe that the rhythm is the most important, because without rhythm, you have nothing. And if you break the rhythm, you hear it right away. You can play a wrong note and get away with it, but you break the rhythm and the listener hears it. And I just had this thought the other day. I think that as we search for our voice, it's finding our own rhythm of the words. I think they're really tied. And I think that's one of the things that gives everyone their own unique voice.
That's profound. Listening to you read that poem and hearing the various other sound effects in addition to the rhyme, for somebody who can't keep time to music, that's me. I can understand what you're saying based on how I heard you read that poem. It's interesting. I also teach language learners, and English can be tricky for that. And coming from a very rhythmic language like Spanish, where there are consistent rules, and music seems that they just speak music, in their native language. Trying to mess around with English words and the unnecessary seeming vowels and all that can really confuse that rhythm. And I'm wondering, just as we're speaking, how does that affect the learning process? And is that part of the challenge of English?
Do you ever teach them in song?
Haven't gotten there yet, honestly, but maybe that's the thing for me to do. Is that what you're recommending?
Well, because the song has a melody and it has that, that inlaid rhythm. Well, I mean, that's how we learned our ABCs, right?
True. Well, I am going to make note of that. How do you think Teasdale has influenced your poetry?
I don't write a lot of poetry. I don't consider myself a poet, so I was, flattered when you wanted to have me on your show. I recently had my first published poem, but I like that I don't consider myself a poet, because it kind of takes the pressure off when I write poetry. It's just for me.
Right.
But I think I love her imagery. I love her topic. I might not write exactly like this as she does. I don't tend to write rhyming poems very often, but I love that she's willing to kind of pull it all together in this beautiful format. So how does that influence my poetry? I don't know. When I sit down to write a poem, I'm just channeling. And one time I wrote a poem. I said, I'm too tired to write anything, but I can write a poem. And that wasn't to denigrate a poetry at all, because I think poetry is quite its own challenge. But it was for me to see that it was such an accessible form, poetry. I mean, don't you feel the same way? It's an accessible form.
I do, and as a teacher, I teach poetry all year because I have Gilgamesh and the Odyssey in the curriculum, and we look at works by Lem Sissay and Neil Gaiman and others, and Joy Harjo, and the kids love it, and they love that they can notice how it's all put together, explore their own ideas, and learn from the masters. It's really something to watch that process happen. And I've been reading the book Leaping by Robert Bly, one of our United States former poet laureates, and he explores the idea that Western culture, sort of European Western culture, kind of ditched the idea of the spiritual in poetry, and the leap is to move from the conscious mind to the unconscious mind, and that we're too much about our rationality and our reason, and that we kind of killed it in poetry. And he, in this amazing book, looks to a lot of Spanish language poets to look at how the leaping happens, and it's seamless. And so I was thinking, we have to be very careful when we write to let ourselves be, and to understand the process of finding your voice. Not everything needs to be printed or shared, but then again, it can be, and that learning process will grow. My husband, as it goes, cousin Helene Stupinski is a professional writer. She's written a lot of memoirs, and she's got her first nonfiction piece coming out. And she said to me once that the first draft is the most fun because nobody's looking.
Absolutely.
And I think that's it. You can take your journal and, in your cryptic handwriting, or, on your keyboard, you can just get it down there, and then go read it later, and then say, what form might this work best in? But nobody can take away that first draft from you.
That's right.
That is powerful.
I think many writers agree with that. And also for a novelist, the first novel is a precious experience, because there's no expectation. There's nobody waiting for it, which gives you that freedom to take your time with it too. And I think that's the other thing, that it's the same with pieces of music. You learn a piece of music, and then, a significant piece of music, and you have to live with it. And it's the same with writing. It just, you can't be impatient. You just have to allow it to take its time. And sometimes it means setting it aside for a long time too.
And that's really, I think, what's marvelous about writing. And I guess my joke about the pandemic is some people chose sourdough bread, other people picked up their pens. And some of the other writers that I've spoken to in this podcast have talked about the richness of our world, that poets are available, writers are available, and you can find open mics all over the place, and they're always welcoming communities. I participated in one earlier this week. I had to stay up late because it was in Colorado, and I never heard of the Western Slope before. So while people are talking, I'm searching this up, and I'm listening to a Navajo poet read her work and bringing in her language. And so I was transported to another part of our country and another worldview through language. And I think it's an amazing thing. And I think the open mics that you host at Arts Escape bring people together through language on a regular basis. And we all get to know each other through our poetry and that experience. And that's deeply personal. And I'm not sure I'd know everybody that has participated if I saw them in town, but I feel connected to those people because of the shared endeavor of trying to get at what it is to be human through language. So I'm wondering, would you tell us a little bit more about your first novel?
It's It's a novel. It's a story of a teenager, a female protagonist who has something tragic happen to her. She's involved in an accident, and her father is killed. And her mother cannot forgive her. And the book opens about 6 months later, and she's also a track star. And she's under care. She's under psychiatric care by then, and doing somewhat better, but she's still, torn apart by guilt and grief. And her psychiatrist suggests that she goes away to a week-long grief camp. And most of the story takes place at the grief camp, and then she comes home and faces her mother. And so it's a journey but it's a hopeful journey. And so there you have it. Any publishers out there curious, contact me.
Okay. What is the title?
Right now, it's Each Other Doesn't Make Any Sense.
Nice. And I hear some of the sort of the big issues, right? The life and death issues that affect relationships. That's
yes.
I'll be contacting you for that one.
Okay, great.
Would you be willing to share one of your poems with our listeners?
Sure. I'll share the one that was actually published. And I wrote this on the way home from my uncle's funeral. It's called The Funeral 300 Miles Behind Us, We Cross the Tappan Zee. As we enter the triangles of the bridge's open, cabled sails, Manhattan's spiny skyline appears as an insubstantial silhouette. I claim indifference as my being transcends this concrete passage, and I depart, suspended above the mighty Hudson, and yearn to stay there. Each funeral a rehearsal for death, and the Tappan Zee our practice room.
Wow, that's stunning. I used to cross the Tappan Zee to visit my mother when she was sick with cancer, and all the mythic images of that river crossing between this world and the next would flood my mind and actually be a source of comfort in some ways, despite the difficulty of facing that experience. Thanks for that. Have you shared that publicly?
I have. I've shared it at our open mic at Arts Escape. Yeah. It was an especially grief-filled trip because that was the last living relative in the little town where my parents grew up and where we went every summer. And so I knew that I would never go back there. So, I mean, if I were to go back there, of course, but I probably won't ever, go back there. And so that was, it was the grief that came out in that trip was surprised me.
Because that's a major turning point, that not going back. It's interesting. I sometimes I need to visit Stanford Hospital to see a doctor, and like within miles of where my mother grew up, and it's that weird journey back. You can't go back. The house is different. It looks different. And yet there we are, and it's an ancestral place. Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting thing, but to go back to that place where nobody is anymore, it's gut-wrenching.
It is gut-wrenching. And we, we don't have, as Americans, we don't have the connection to our ancestors so present in our lives, in our daily lives, the way other cultures do, how they honor their ancestors and talk about them, more, have that real sense of lineage, and that can kind of ground you even among, in the midst of that sense of loss. And I think that's another thing that we need to develop, and that's part of, facing death and seeing the long line.
I hear you. And even our elders being in assisted living or nursing homes, sometimes it's a necessary thing, and yet, I remember in my own family, that's not how it went when you were home and it was around you. And I remember my mother was very prosaic. She said to me once, people were dying all the time at Park Lane, but you had to put your shoes on and go to work. this idea that you have to, good old New Englander, right? Deal with it and understand that this is a part of our reality and part of being here. And that comment also came out of a world where people were in the house, that there were generations in the house, and that has changed. I mean, corporate immigrations to different parts of the world that take people away from homeland. It's big.
It is big.
Well, thank you for memorializing that with that amazing, amazing poem.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking me to read it.
And thank you for being a part of People and Their Poems podcast. And we'll have resources posted in the podcast notes. So if anybody wants to follow up on Sarah Teasdale and your works, they can keep track and be a part of the conversation that way. So thank you so very much today.
Thank you, Sandy. This has been great.
This has been People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. Be sure to check the show notes for any special links relating to this episode. If you want to learn more about the podcast, visit peopleandtheirpoems.net. Or if you want to learn more about Sandy and her work, visit sandycarlson.net. Thanks for listening.